So the last part of part three of the novel is quite heartbreaking, and it involves the fate of Rodwell. Um, so at this point in the novel, the sort of realities of war are apparent as the lives of these young men are being destroyed, and it seems to escalate the violence, the description of the weaponry. On page 131, they describe the technology that was being used was new weapons were being invented, including the flamethrower, the use of liquid warfare. We've already seen gas attacks, and the carnage is just, rampant, right? So there is bodies of men everywhere. The description is quite disturbing at the bottom of 132. Firestorms raged along the front. Men were exploded where they stood, blown apart by the combustion. Winds, with the velocity of cyclones, tore the guns from their emplacements and flung them about like toys. Horses fell with their bones on fire. Men went blind in the heat. Blood ran out of their noses, ears, and mouths. Wells and springs of water were plugged and stopped by the bodies of men and mules and dogs who had gone there for safety. The storms might last for hours until the clay was baked and the earth was seared and sealed with fire. So you can imagine witnessing something like that, ultimate destruction of all living things, what that would do to somebody's mental state, their emotional state. Obviously, that would be destructive for anybody. We've already seen Levitt had gone quite mad, right? It says on the bottom of page 132. So he has broken his spirit is broken, and he's suffering from what's obviously some form of post-traumatic stress disorder, or shell shock as it was known in World War I. And then we have Rodwell also suffering, and his fate is tragic as well. The rabbit, the hedgehog, and the bird that he'd rescued had all were asphyxiated. They're all asphyxiated in the gas attack, and except for the toad, right? The toad he put into the water pail, and there it wasn't. It was able to sort of stay alive. And then Rodwell is reassigned, and they move him to another group of men, and these men had been on the front lines and witnessing the firestorms, which we just described as being, immensely disturbing. Men just fell or, melted. And it's acknowledged that some of them were madmen, so 135 at the top. This was understandable, perhaps. When Rodwell appeared, he found them slaughtering rats and mice, burning them alive in their cooking fires. Then Rodwell tries to step in because we know he is a compassionate man and feels strongly for animals. And then they made him watch them torture and kill a cat. And then after that, Rodwell commits suicide. So he wandered into no man's land and put a bullet through his ears rather than endure any more of this sort of madness, right? And then there's this sort of touching letter that he wrote to his daughter before he commits suicide. And he writes to his daughter, Lorene. He says, I am alive in everything I touch. Touch these pages and you will have me at your fingertips. We survive in one another. Everything lives forever. Believe it. Nothing dies. I am always your father, always. So he gives this letter to Robert to send to his daughter. And that's how Rodwell ends his story. And then Robert eventually is released of his duty for now, where he will spend his time recovering in St. Aubin's. And the very last image of part 3 is Robert looking at Rodwell's sketchbooks. This is page 138, and in his sketchbooks, Rodwell had done images, illustrations of animals, all his animals that he had in cages. And then there's Robert. So he's the one human figure in all of these illustrations. The rest of it is just animals. So I don't know how you want to interpret that one. Perhaps Robert has a quality that is similar to an animal. He's kind of innocent, or he is like the guardian, right, of animals, of those who are weak or suffering. He has like a sort of compassion or connection with animals, spiritually aligned, spiritually connected with them. And then, so the description is on page 138. There were 5 in all. In all of them, on every page, the drawings were of animals, or maybe 100 sketches. Robert's was the only human form. Modified and mutated, he was one with the others. What had Rodwell meant by this? Or was it just the way he drew? And Robert releases the toad into what he finds, the one little green patch. Once he's released, he took the toad and then released it. So this is sort of a symbolic act, releasing the frog into a safe spot. So again, whether, what is Robert's connection with animals? We see them aligned in this instance where Rodwell recognizes something in Robert, and there's this sort of spiritual affinity between Robert and animals, or symbolic connection that's evident, and we'll see how that develops in the final sections of the novel, where Robert's his connection with animals becomes even more apparent, and how it is tied to his identity and sense of self. So part 4 revolves around the transcribed interviews between the narrator, who's again compiling this record of Robert Ross, who he was, trying to find research about what really happened and solve this kind of mystery around this infamous person. And he interviews Juliet Dorsey, and she at this point is an old woman, but she has survived. She knew Robert Ross firsthand, and she was a 12 years old girl when Robert came to visit St. Aubin's, and she was, again, knew Robert firsthand and recorded a lot of these stories that she's going to tell the narrator in a diary. So she'll read diary entries written from her perspective as a 12-year-old girl. So the diary entries do have a kind of perception or worldview. The perspective is written from a child's point of view. So there are moments where the young girl doesn't quite understand what's going on, or she sees things from, again, the 12-year-old's point of view. So there's some things going on that maybe she doesn't quite understand, but we as the reader have more insight into what's the sort of tension and conflicts between the characters. So Juliet Dorsey, her childlike perception as a 12-year-old girl also kind of reiterates this theme of innocence, and from being innocent into growing up a little bit, right? So that Bildungsroman genre that we talked about is also played out with Juliet Dorsey's character, where she moves from a kind of innocent and childlike perspective to a more experienced or more mature point of view. So she's growing up as well as she witnesses some of the conflicts that she is sort of observing in her older siblings, their lives, and the romantic life of her older sister Barbara, who we know moves from one soldier to a next when she's through with them. And in this part we learn that Barbara Dorsey has starts a love affair with Robert Ross. So has moved on from Taffler to Robert Ross. And there's sort of the romantic conflict kind of unfolds in a kind of traumatic way, where Robert learns that Taffler has been significantly wounded in the war, So at this point, Robert Ross is the one who has Barbara has put up on a pedestal. He's a war hero at this point. He's survived. He's been to the front lines, and now she sort of worships him. So she's moved on from Taffler. So if you flip back to page 96, this is the first introduction to Lady Juliet D'Orsay, and this is where the narrator describes how she is now in her 70s, and he goes to visit her, and this is where he's trying to interview her to get information about Robert Ross. And we have, she's described on page 98, so she has short grizzled hair that has always been curly and fine, long quivering hands that are crippled with arthritis. She is tall and seems to be very dangerously thin. She is one of those women who live on a starvation diet by their own free choice. Hers consists of spinach and Melba toast, cigarettes, and a lot of gin. The gin has no effect whatsoever on her speech or the clarity of her mind. It is simply one of her foods. She sits with her hips smoking against one side of the chair, leaning towards the other side, smoking one cigarette after another. She doesn't seem to be able to butt them very successfully. The ashtray smolders the whole afternoon. She is proud of Robert Ross. The only time that anger flashes is when she mentions his detractors. The name of Stuart Ross, for instance, causes her to stutter. Still, she admits, when she's regained her composure, a brother is a brother. I had them myself. And then you say, it's as if Robert did something evil. Some say he did. Some maniac. So yes, I've heard that too. So she is one of Robert's defenders, and she acknowledges Stuart Ross. So Robert's younger brother is one of his detractors. But Juliet D'Orsay is very much proud of what Robert Ross did. At this point, we still don't know what he did, but she gives us more insight into his character and what happens to him during this part of his when he is recuperating. He's damaged his knees. So he's on leave in these moments, and he is at St. Aubin's, where Taffler is also being treated. So Juliet D'Orsay recalls this episode where Robert Ross first comes to St. Aubin's, and then he's interested in reuniting with Captain Taffler, who he hasn't seen since they discarded or released Harris's ashes into the sea. So he's reunited with Captain Taffler, but young Juliet does not do this properly. She says, "Poor Robert Ross, it wasn't fair. I'd bungled it. I should have been more forthright when he'd mentioned Captain Taffler first. The shock was terrible." So Robert Ross enters into the infirmary at St. Aubin's and discovers that Captain Taffler has lost both of his arms. And this is a shock to him. He didn't realize that. And then Juliet feels sort of guilty and bad for not warning Robert that this had happened. So Taffler has lost both of his arms. So at this point, he and Barbara, you can sort of put things together and realize that she has already moved on. She's dating Major Terry, and things weren't going so well between them either. So Barbara seems to be the one who's interested in Robert Ross and initiates his staying in St. Aubin's in the first place. So Barbara is interested in Robert Ross. Young Juliet doesn't quite realize what's going on. She just is sort of observing everybody and doesn't quite pick up the idea that there's a romantic connection between Barbara and Robert. And it seems as if Taffler and Robert are also, Robert is very affected by seeing Taffler with both his arms gone. The fact that Taffler was, a football athlete known for throwing those long passes and throwing stones, and here he is, he's lost both arms. It's another sort of tragic